Hey there, welcome to the second episode of the RUSTWORKS podcast. Today we're going to be talking about episode 1 of The Wolf of New Orleans, as well as the creation of that series. But first, let's get into the episode briefing. Monster and Bride has already been started here on Patreon. It's going to be having each update is basically going to be starting on Patreon first, and then will be released to the public the following week. Now, the official days right now, I'm still juggling on, but this week you'll get the next chapter for Monster and Bride, and then the following day will be when it will come out, essentially. I'm trying to keep it to a weekly basis. I want to make sure I do that, but I also want to make sure that there's something here that gives people more of an incentive to check out the Patreon, as well as the podcast. Speaking of which, the recording of this, I was a little bit behind on. I was trying to get this done on Friday, but then I messed up the second half of the recording, and then I got busy on Saturday, so I've been a little bit busy trying to catch up on this. But yeah, anyway, speaking of The Wolf of New Orleans, episode 2 is almost done with storyboarding. Right now, there's 10 pages fully sketched out, and then going to be lined up next. But the storyboarding is basically almost done. There's just only like a couple more pages to get storyboarded out, thumbnailed, and then they get the cleanup sketch done. Right now, those 10 pages are cleaned up sketch, so they're ready to get lined and all the like on that. But yeah, that's about it. Let's get into today's episode with The Wolf of New Orleans, episode 1. So, before we get into the actual episode itself, let's talk about the conception of this series. So, a fun fact, this wasn't originally meant to be its own series. At one point, the main character, Ruger, was meant to be a side character back when I was working on the Crips and Cowboys project. Now, there may be some confusion about this, and I want to make a video where I fully explain everything going on. But Crips and Cowboys started its life as kind of like this big comic project that I was wanting to do with Unbreakable Iron Ranger, well, after Unbreakable Iron Ranger, that basically featured multiple protagonists. It was kind of more of somewhat of an anthology series where, like, there wasn't like this major overarching plot. It was more just like you were exploring this world with different characters. There was a big cast that you would be following and just shifting the perspective on. And Ruger was one of the side characters that we would have met when I was going to be having the cast go to Louisiana. However, I ended up taking a lot of a liking to... Sorry, not a lot of a liking. That's bad grammar. I took a very much strong liking to Ruger as a character, and over time, he's developed more from just being a side character that was only in Louisiana to joining the gang later on, and eventually having a deuteragonist role alongside Ben for when I was trying to redo the Crips and Cowboys project. However, then I decided to just make Crips and Cowboys more just like the brand name for everything in this universe, like the Crips and Cowboys universe. But I was still wanting to have Ruger be kind of a secondary protagonist to Ben for when I wanted to do a different series involving him. But eventually, I just kind of got to a point where I realized Ruger himself works just as good as Ben as a central protagonist. And then that led to me wanting to make a series as I was working on finishing up Unbreakable Iron Ranger, and I was realizing I kind of just want to work on something new for a bit and refresh my brain. And that led to the conception of The Wolf of New Orleans. I started getting to work, planning things out, making sure that everything was ready to go, and trying to plan out just like a short story, just so I could stick with that in case things went awry again, because as I think I stated in the last episode, that Unbreakable Iron Ranger unfortunately entered this really bad phase where I was going like back and forth on the length of the series. And that led to a lot of problems down the line. And so for this, I was like, okay, I want to keep this relatively short. Even if it goes on a little longer, I know that I have this hard thing, and I know that there's only so much content I could get out of this, and I have to stick within the limitations of it. So I had to make sure that if I was going to work on this, it wasn't going to be too drawn out or too complicated or get too, how should I put this? It wouldn't blow up too quickly. And what I mean by this is in terms of the narrative itself. Unbreakable Iron Ranger, for better or for worse, had a lot of potential to go in various different directions in terms of like scale and size of the story. But that also caused a lot of problems because even though I originally had like a smaller scale plan for it, there was that desire to keep pushing it to be more of a bigger and grander scale. And that was a problem because of that going back and forth between the two. So for this series, I wanted it to be, no matter what, This is where the series ends. This is the scale. It doesn't get any bigger than this. So even if it goes longer, this is as big as we're going. And I think it's important as well to have limitations when you're working on different series. It's not that you want to like hinder yourself, but you want to be able to understand like the actual rules and understand the actual specifics that you're trying to do for any kind of piece of art that you create. A lot of people say that, oh, there's no rules to art, you can do whatever you want. But believe it or not, there are principles, there are rules in art that help guide you into furthering and building your craft. They're not, now, granted, you can bend the rules and break them later on, but they're there to help you understand how to get a grasp on what you're achieving with art and like how we break art down essentially. And with Unbreakable Iron Ranger, I actually did this thing early on where I was like, okay, only 22 pages per episode, and when I get comfortable, we'll extend it to 30 pages. And honestly, that's what I did with The Wolf of New Orleans. I decided to go back to that's those limitations I had. Like, okay, the maximum of pages I could do, 30. If it's that, did too much. I need to either extend that over into the next episode, or I need to reformat things. And we'll talk about some of the things that happened in regards to that later on. But that was basically what I wanted to do. With this, I wanted to regain my passion for comic creation and get refocus essentially and get back to finding a good process in terms of creating episodes. Now, granted, I was trying to get this whole episode out by November of 2025. Like it was going to start on Halloween and then end in November of 2025. It's not end until January, unfortunately. And it not horrible, but I was wanting to get it done sooner because I wanted to get back into that rhythm, especially since it was just only one episode. I didn't want to take too long. I was scared of it extending out because I remember when I was working on episode 14 of Unbreakable Iron Ranger, that took a literal year, and that was only black and white pages. That was during some of the peak of my depression there. There was a number of factors that led to it being as long as it was. It was mainly the depression. It was mainly that peak of my depression slowly eating away at me and making me feel like I couldn't do this. So yeah, but there was that old fear, and I want to make sure that I could just focus on getting this done and making sure that like it fit like just as a really good solid introduction. But yeah, we'll talk a little bit more about that. But the whole point is that this spawned off from an original project that I had where I was going to involve a big cast, and then Ruger came out of it, and he ended up being one of my favorite characters. That was just supposed to be a side character, and he ended up finding his way into being this protagonist character, and I love him for that. It gives him, honestly, a little bit more of this underdog vibe to him. Like, you weren't expecting any of this out of this goofball, but I hope that it helps further people's perception of him and like his character arc, and it only enhances it. Like they see this character, this goofball, and they connect with him because given that both literal and metaphorical underdog kind of status. Yeah, now with this series, I wanted to make sure it was different from Unbreakable Iron Ranger. Even though I love to use similar tropes and cliches and things like that, even though I have a lot, like it has the same art style, it has the same character designs for the most part. I wanted to make sure there were some major differences. First off, Unbreakable Iron Ranger was made to be more of an action adventure series. It was much more high octane action. It was meant to be more akin to like certain series like JoJo and Fist of the North Star and all these older series where it was more battle focus. Not that there aren't any battle shown today, but what I mean by that is that in those days, especially in JoJo, a lot of the fights were storytelling as well. Like a lot of fights, especially in like part 4 as an example, is that the fights basically told the stories of the characters. And so for me, that's how I based the stories of Unbreakable Iron Ranger. Same, and alongside with Samurai Jack, I want to make sure it was episodic, helped me to get my feet on the ground with creating comics. I took a more episodic approach and having the episode, like the story being written around the fights, so we understand the characters and how their abilities relate to their character and like, that kind of thing. But with The Wolf of New Orleans, I wanted to try to do a bit more of a more continuous storytelling, have a little bit more continuity. It's not that there wasn't any continuity in Unbreakable Iron Ranger, but what I mean is that the story continues and presses on. It's not like it was just purely, it's not like it's going to be episodic where, okay, this one episode, Ben is escaping from horror show. This one, now he's in Alabama trying to find this Green River monster. This episode, he's now in Las Vegas. But this thing, I wanted to be, since it was entirely set in New Orleans, well, it starts off over in outside of New Orleans. But the whole point is that it takes place in Louisiana, specifically in New Orleans. And I wanted it to be more of a continuous narrative. I wanted it to be about Ruger uncovering this mystery. And so because of that, I wanted things to be like a progressing story as Ruger finds out the undergoing plot underneath the city, essentially. I wanted it to be more of a continuous story versus it just being more episodic, because I could do that, but I wanted this to be more unique. I wanted this to be more of a challenge in itself that got me excited. And I wanted it to also be a bit more of a horror series, not heavy, heavy horror where like it was just only scares all the time and it's bleak. What I mean is, I want there to be more scares and want things to be more like Ruger was just put in more of a horrifying situation. Ben was put through some harrowing situations before, sure, but it had more of a tone of just battle manga and such, and like fighting up like superhero, like the monster of the week type of plots. It's not that there isn't anything here for Ruger, but it's more like Ruger is finding himself going up against these horrors and having to face his own fears and trying to become his own hero in the same way that Ben did. But instead of it always being physically, it's about, gaining more of that courage and maturing, basically, is the idea. So both characters grow in different ways. For Ben, it's about growing stronger and accepting himself, essentially, as we've discovered later on in the story, like accepting his origins and accepting everything about himself, that he himself is not strong by himself, but he is still strong with the people that he has, essentially. And that even though he may not be strong by himself, he wants to make sure that he has the will to keep pushing forward because he wants to help others. He has that drive, essentially. So for him, it's about learning how to overcome the hurdles that he has, the physical disabilities that he has, and his origins, essentially, and grappling with that. For Ruger, it's grappling with trauma. It's grappling with himself in some ways as well, like in different ways with Ben. But whereas Ben, it was more about, like, is he really... that sounds like spoilers. But basically, Ben, it grapples in a different way with Ruger. Ruger's more grapple for this story is more about, like, is he good enough? Is he strong enough? Can he even handle this or succeed in this? That's his thing. I mean, Ben also struggled in that in a similar way, but for Ruger, it's a lot more of this daunting fear, and it comes from a different place because I was trying to take this that was touched on in later of Unbreakable Iron Ranger, but here, a lot more about, like, that depression and that imposter syndrome and that feeling of despair, essentially. And that's what I wanted it to be about. And that's why I gave Ruger a very much more comedic looking, like cartoonish character design, because I wanted there to be, even though Ruger comes off one way, there's still that hope inside of him. There's still that goofy nature deep buried inside of the trauma that he faces and the doubt that he has in himself. Inside of him, there's something there. There's something strong within him deep down, essentially. Similar themes to Unbreakable Iron Ranger, but it handles it in a different way and goes in a different topic. Like, it goes to the same destination, but it takes a different path to explain it. There's multiple different ways to talk about this topic, and when it comes, I was trying to make a good way of explaining it, but basically the whole point is with The Wolf of New Orleans, it's essentially about overcoming your depression and overcoming your fears and overcoming yourself, essentially, like your own doubts, your own fears, and your own because you could be your own worst enemy. And for Ruger, he struggled with that. I don't want to spoil everything about that, but Ruger suffered with that a lot. Ben was a lot more gung-ho, like, okay, I'm going to do this because I want to help everybody, because I know that I got to do this. And Ben believes that he has the power to do it, but Ruger, he doesn't. Right now, Ruger kind of feels kind of helpless. Even though he's just gotten these cool werewolf powers, he doesn't fully understand them. And right now, it seems like everything is being stripped away from him, or he's being pushed out of his old life, essentially. And so it's like, how do you deal with that? How do you deal with that trauma? How do you deal with it feeling like your world is just crumbling down and you feel like you're sinking? You feel like you're sinking. And that's why I brought Ben in later in this episode, because I wanted to use Ben as a mentor character to help Ruger out through this, because Ben didn't really have that early on. He had friends to help him, but Ben was kind of exploring his own journey by himself. But now Ruger has somebody to help him. Ben's now able to help somebody get through this journey, or at least help them set them on the right direction. But yeah, but like I said, that's why I wanted to go more of a horror direction with this. I wanted the enemies to be a lot more just, not psychological horror, but just more like they're just terrifying. You know, like the enemies that Ben faced, they were terrifying in terms of power, but at the end of the day, there was still more of an explanation for them, like the logic that was given, with a few exceptions. But with Ruger here and his enemies, even though we may have an explanation of their origin, how they work, we don't know. They're just these magic monsters, and they're terrifying. And we're trying to figure out how to. You'll see the characters have to figure out how to combat their abilities and take care of them and deal with them. But it's basically just about overcoming those fears and learning to understand them, so that way you can conquer it. Basically, conquering that fear. But yeah, sorry, I kind of got pausing there. I was just trying to catch my train of thought. Sometimes when I get running off like this, the train goes in a few different directions. I will say with this episode, there's, in my personal opinion, a little bit more to talk about and discuss, because there was a lot. This sounds bad, but there was a lot more forethought that went into this versus Unbreakable Iron Ranger, which is weird because like Unbreakable Iron Ranger went through so many different iterations trying to perfect this story. But it still started simple. But here, I was actively having to think about, okay, how do I make this different from Unbreakable Iron Ranger? How do I shorten this whole series down and learn from my mistakes from Unbreakable Iron Ranger? That's what I mean by it's a bit more, there's more forethought, because I have grown and learned a lot from Unbreakable Iron Ranger. With this series, I wanted to figure out, where can I continue doing what was great about this, but I am able to refine and better where I am weaker at, essentially. And so that way I can make this better. And that feels bad, you know, like you're saying that, but like I want, every time I do a bigger project, I want it to be better than the last, hopefully better than the last, because you don't want to go into things swinging to be the worst. You want to go in and say, okay, how can I make this better? How can I improve, essentially? And I think that's important, because I don't want this to be this giant, long series. I learned my lesson really good with Unbreakable Iron Ranger, that I work better in smaller scale and segmenting these stories out and containing them. Maybe at some point I'll be able to do a long-form narrative, but I also need people to help me out. And with what I do and how I handle everything myself, I know that my limitation dictates that I have to keep this shorter and more contained. And I can't just keep going for a long narrative, especially if I don't have help, because otherwise I'm going to burn myself out. And I learned that the hard way with Unbreakable Iron Ranger. Now then, as for the story itself and the setting, I decided to have it start on Mardi Gras, which is specifically Fat Tuesday into Ash Wednesday. And the reason why is because I thought it would fit in with the themes and the origins of the Rougarou, and being tied in some instances to Lent. So here's a fun fact for you guys, a fun fact about Mardi Gras as a whole. So Mardi Gras is tied to Easter, and it's also kind of tied to Christmas. So here's the thing. So the beginning of the Mardi Gras season, King's Day or Epiphany, is the day that represents when the wise men found the baby Jesus, when they found baby Jesus. And so basically that was after Christmas. So that's what that day represents. And then it's a big celebration up until Fat Tuesday, which is the final day that everybody parties and gets full-on food and all these snacks and stuff, because the day after is Ash Wednesday, the beginning of Lent. And this is what these were originally Catholic holidays, by the way, just to give you understanding. And Lent would last up until Easter, essentially. I'm probably misremembering that. It was probably either Good Friday or Easter. But point being is that Lent was supposed to be this fasting period that lasted until Easter, essentially. So basically, you're stockpiling through Mardi Gras. Then during Lent, you were basically fasting throughout this whole period up until Easter came, essentially. That was the whole point. Like I said, I might be misremembering how the dates exactly coalesce, like in terms of like If the let me actually double check that real quick. So okay, so it ends on the Friday. Okay, so it ends on the Friday. So okay, so it technically does end on Thursday. So I was wrong, actually. It doesn't end on Easter. It ends just before Easter, essentially. But that's the whole point, is that it's meant to be a period like a in when it comes to fasting, is you're leaning on God, you're leaning and trying to uh not rely on eating or relying on these other things, and learning to put yourself in God, essentially. That's the point of fasting in a religious sense. And when it comes to the origins of the Rougarou in some instances was tied to Lent. So if you broke Lent, you would get turned to a Rougarou. It was basically like a boogeyman type of thing, essentially. And so I thought, that would actually be a pretty good way of introducing the Rougarou and having a little tied theme. But I didn't want it to be like, oh, Rougarou was cursed into this because he did something bad. No, because sometimes shit just happens. You could do all the good you want in the world. You could do everything right, and you still get screwed over. Because that's just how the world is, unfortunately. But for that, I wanted it to be used more as a period of revival, essentially, for like a period of like a loss and revival, essentially, where Ruger loses everything in his old life and has a new life, essentially, here, and is trying to struggle with it and trying to find a way to cope and like survive with this new curse that he has. So that was basically Ruger's the whole idea I wanted to do with Mardi Gras, essentially being like this period of turnover and change and a chance for Ruger to grow, essentially. That's what I wanted to do, and I thought it would fit perfectly having the episode basically start at the end of Mardi Gras and moving into that Lent period. So there we go. That's what I wanted to do, because I thought, like I said, it would fit in with the growth of Ruger's character, essentially. Now, that doesn't mean the whole series is going to take place during Lent. And for all I know, that's probably going to be going on till it's going to, like, the period of it's going to be going after Lent. But like I said, I wanted it to, like, like in a metaphorical way, represent that change in Ruger's life, essentially. So, yeah. Speaking of which, let's talk about the Rougarou himself. So, Ruger's name is actually derived from Travis Tritt. His last name is, because his full name is Ruger Lou Tritt. Ruger Lou Tritt literally is just the Ruger Lou, the Ruger L, the Ruger Lou. It's literally just Rougarou. It's just a play on words there. But yeah, his full name is Ruger Louis Tritt. So Ruger Louis Tritt, otherwise known as Ruger Lou. But yeah, that was just meant to be a play on the words there. The Ruger, though, was kind of a happy accident, though. And then it just kind of led to this whole thing of like, hey, what if I just named all the werewolves after firearms? There's only one that doesn't really fit that whole theme, but later kind of technically did by just a hair, and that is Mother Lycan. Her first name is Taylor, last name is Benatar, but her namesake was taken by Taylor from one of the members of Duran Duran, and the last name Benatar from Pat Benatar. But Taylor just barely managed to click in as a reference to, I believe it was a gun manufacturer or a type of gun, one or the other. But Ruger is both Ruger, the name, is reference to a gun manufacturer. But yeah, so that ended up being a trend where I was just like, what if I just named what if I just named the werewolves after firearms and things like that? And I decided to take that after Full Metal Alchemist, because in Full Metal Alchemist, all the military officers and members are named after different army equipment or weaponry, essentially. But as for the other music inspirations, I talked about his last name being derived from Travis Tritt, who is a country artist that me and my family grew up with. Another music inspiration for Ruger is Call Me the Breeze, the song. And there's two artists specifically that made that. There's two covers of the song. The original version by J.J. Cale and Leonard Skinner's cover of it, which is oh my god, such a good. It's so good. Have you ever heard that? Listen to Call Me the Breeze by Leonard Skinner, their cover. It's amazing. I know you guys have probably heard like the Freebird guitar solo. Listen to that piano. It's so freaking good. Oh my god. But like that whole song, the Leonard Skinner version was just like such a good fit for Ruger in terms of like his energy and personality. It felt so much like the Big Easy. I was like, dude, I got to put this in for Ruger. I'm putting this in for Ruger. But yeah. As for the character inspirations himself, there's a lot. So Beowulf from Skullgirls is is an inspiration for Ruger's character design. So at this point, Beowulf from Skullgirls is just kind of used as the guy to shape my protagonists. Could you tell that I really love that character as one of my mains? But anyway, so for Ruger, he was based off of Beowulf's design and like the color scheme a little bit more so, but the goofier nature too that Beowulf had. Not so much for Ruger being arrogant and cocky, but more so the goofier nature and just the comedic side of things. You know, but that's where that side of things came from, Ruger. Sorry about that. I was having to check something real quick because I was about to talk about this next character. But John Talbane is another character that inspired Ruger to an extent, which is funny because like Beowulf shares some similar moves to John Talbane from Darkstalkers, but that also was used but John Talbane was also used as a reference for Ruger's design and combat abilities for the most part. But yeah, sorry, my brain is really fried. I forgot to write John Talbane down on here, and I wanted to make sure that I got the name pronunciation right because I know that like sometimes I fuck up the pronunciations. One time I called him John Talbot for whatever fucking reason. So I was like, oh god, man, I gotta fix that. I gotta fix that. But another character that Ruger was inspired by is, and this is funny, Rolf the Wolf from Showbiz Pizza Place. You know, the Rockafire explosion. But yeah, so that was this is a very long line of logic. Okay, so so for those of you who know about Five Nights at Freddy's, there's of course people know about Chuck E. Cheese, but there was another pizza place like it with animatronics, which is Showbiz Pizza Place. And so I'm pretty sure it was it Showbiz? I gotta look this up now. I'm so sorry. Showbiz Pizza Place. Yes, it was Showbiz Pizza Place that had the Rockafire explosion. Sorry, my brain fried for there for a moment. But yeah, so the Rockafire explosion basically had this whole cast of animatronics, and there was also two other side performances, which was Billy Bob and Rolf the Wolf. Rolf the Wolf was this wolf character that had his own little puppet, Earl Schmerl, and Billy Bob was the mascot, basically, for all intents and purposes, of the the Showbiz Pizza Place. And their designs basically were kind of combined together to create Ruger's design. The overalls from Billy Bob, the general, the wolf, the being a wolf essentially. But those two characters combined basically created created Ruger. I am running at 1,000,000 miles an hour, and I do apologize. I'm tongue-tying myself here on the fly. Oh well. But yeah, but the reason why also is kind of ties back because it made me think a lot more about because of like why they skinned the faces, because I always thought about that. And then one time we went to a cabin to as a little family retreat, and I saw on the rug, and this was in 2022 by the way, when we went to this little retreat over in the Blue Ridge Mountains, they had this like it wasn't a rug, it was this little throw that was on the couch. And it was a bear throw, essentially. It was this bear blanket throw that was made of bear fur, and it had a bear face on it that was skinned. And that's where I realized, oh, okay, so they literally skin the animals, skin their faces back in the day for this kind of stuff. That's crazy. But that made me realize, okay, so that's why a lot of those cartoon characters, like for the wolves and the bears, sometimes they would have skinned faces like that. I was so confused why they did that. I thought... or it was kind of like a way to like make it easier for them to have expressions so that way they weren't being covered up by fur and stuff, because I know that they were like trying their best in some instances to make them as humanoid as possible, like the insects especially. Like I was like, why did they do that with the insects though? Because the reason why they designed the animals with those like more skinned muzzles and stuff is because they did that with some of those animals back in the day. So I was like, okay, so that wasn't just a cartoon thing. Okay, cool, real cool. But yeah, so that's a fun little story there. But speaking of that, though, Ruger was based in general off of a lot of like more classic cartoons, like from Looney Tunes, specifically Wile E. Coyote and Ralph Wolf. So that sounds weird. There's two wolf characters literally named like that sound similar, like Wolf the Wolf and Ralph Wolf. But let me explain. So obviously you know Wile E. Coyote from the Roadrunner cartoons. But there was also Ralph Wolf, who was this wolf character that looked exactly like Wile E. Coyote, but he had a different color nose. And he went up against Sam Sheepdog. I used them together because it was basically, for all intents and purposes, the same design. It was minor changes. But that facial structure of Ruger's mouth and muzzle was taken from Wile E. Coyote. But the general, the body and frame, though, was taken from Sonic's Werehog form from Sonic Unleashed. Because I always loved that form. And I love the fact that his arms are able to stretch like that. And so I decided to use that as well as put that in as part of Ruger's kit. And I combined this all together because I wanted Ruger to look as fantastical as possible. Because with the Rougarou, there are more magic origins in comparison. So let me get into a little bit about the Rougarou real quick. So the Rougarou stems from the word loup-garou, which is literally French for werewolf. And this word Rougarou is basically the Cajun version of loup-garou, because the Cajun culture came from the Acadians that were exiled from Nova Scotia, and they made their way all the way down to Louisiana. And that's where, but during all that, basically the term loup-garou, which originated from France, and being French for werewolf, got converted basically into rougarou. But yeah, that's where that whole thing came from. However, the Rougarou had, like as I talked about earlier, had a bit more fantastical origins in some instances about how the Rougarou was formed. In some cases, actually, the Rougarou, the curse of the Rougarou is by a Rougarou staring at you, apparently, in some instances. And not just like being bitten by one, but either by staring at you, like you catch that and that thing stares back at you, you turn into a Rougarou. If you break lint, you turn into a Rougarou. So it was a lot more of like had more instances of having a more of a magical curse type of effect instead of more of that modern day viral effect where, like, if you get bitten by a werewolf or a werewolf, if you're bitten by a vampire or a werewolf, you become a vampire or a werewolf, respectively. And so for that, I wanted to make Ruger look as fantastical and as, like, for lack of a better word, unrealistic as possible. And the reason why I did that is because I wanted Ruger to look more distinct and magical. Because there was a character that I had, I mentioned her, Taylor, Mother Lycan. She is a werewolf, and I was going to have her debut her werewolf form early on, but I didn't. But I always had that in mind. I was like, okay, but I don't want to double up unless I have a good reason to double up, or I have an idea to make this character more distinct. That's a rule that I follow because I want to make sure each character feels memorable and I'm not just rehashing things. And I know it's going to be impossible. Sometimes you're going to end up rehashing things without even knowing, but it goes back to that whole idea of like limitations and creativity that, like, because here's the thing, limitations, giving yourself guidelines and restrictions can end up causing more creativity to flow. And so that's why I did it. I wanted to make sure that I can make as unique a character as I could. And if I ended up duplicating like a similar trope or something, I wanted to change it or switch it or use some other inspirations to make them more distinct. It's also why I introduced the first vampire in the series as a more Nosferatu vampire, like more Nosferatu inspired vampire instead of the more Draculan, because I wanted to be a little bit more unique. Also because I didn't know if I was going to use Dracula or even the traditional vampire. So I was like I didn't know if I was going to use Dracula or something similar to that. And I was like, okay, I'm going to do a Nosferatu inspired vampire. I think that'll be cooler. And that makes Monsoon stand out more by making him more inspired by this other iteration that has kind of become more obscure over time. Although now that there's the fucking Nosferatu movie. So, yeah. Anyway, but that's why I wanted to make sure that Ruger felt like a very cartoony kind of character. It's because I wanted him to be distinctly feel more like he had magical origins. I didn't want him to feel realistic. I wanted him to feel more like this was a curse, that this was impossible by normal biological means. Even though that, well, technically speaking, werewolves are impossible. But you know what I mean? With werewolves, like the organic biological werewolves in series, I wanted them to make sense and feel like, okay, these are man wolves. But Ruger, I wanted to be a cartoon character to make the distinction between the organic or viral infection of werewolves versus the magical curse. of werewolves. That's what I wanted to do. Back on topic though, I forgot to mention this, but DK Donkey Kong was actually used as inspiration for like some of the combat and like movement of Ruger himself, like the way that he has the way that he carries himself and acts. Very inspired by Donkey Kong as well. That love character, and it worked out pretty great because when I was before I started committing to the Wolf of New Orleans, they introduced the brand new Donkey Kong game, Donkey Kong Bonanza. And I was like, yeah, I feel a lot more solid about going this more cartoony direction for Ruger, and I went more ham with it. So yeah. Ellis from Left 4 Dead was another character that inspired Ruger's personality. That's just another little fun fact there. Not much else there really, but the last character that inspired Ruger and also adds into the horror vibes of the series is Courage the Cowardly Dog. You probably see this with like the way that Ruger's eyes are designed and his nose, but Ruger's character was also based off of Courage, which works out great because Courage goes up against like these absolute horrific abominations and has to go out of his way in order to save the day and save his family, or like have to go through these precarious situations. And so I thought that'd be great inspiration for Ruger because it basically is just kind of like a more anime inspired Courage the Cowardly Dog type of thing, you know. So yeah, that's where that came from there. But yeah, those are the characters that inspired Ruger's design essentially and his whole aesthetic. Oh, there's one more. I forgot. So, from Sky High, the reason why Ruger's arms have those little stripes is because of Lash from Sky High. If you don't know who that is, there was this kid that had like stretching arms, like stretching powers in the movie, and he had like these little stripes and such. So that's where that came from. And I wanted to do that because like, oh, that's really cool the way that his stripes like on his sleeves like stretch and things like that. And I want to do that for Ruger to help indicate and hint towards more of that stretching arm ability. And one more thing. Oh, sorry, my phone just dinged. But one more thing. Ruger's werewolf design was inspired by the case hunt, and that's because my family we typically get case hunts, and so the way that the coat of the dogs are they're very fluffy dogs. They're Spitz breed, and you might think them as being like a fat Pomeranian, but yeah, they were originally barge dogs and they were mousers. They ran around the ship eating rats and taking care of them, and they were also like guard dogs as well. They were like be really good with kids and just keep out alert for them and that kind of thing. And so I thought that would fit well for Ruger as well. Not only just because I love that breed of dog, but because I thought they'll fit well with Ruger. Granted, he doesn't have the same color scheme as a Kason, but it's for the most part, you can see the inspiration. Like if you take Ruger and you put him next to a picture of a Kason, you could see the inspiration of like how his like beard mane flows and such, and like also like the way that his legs are formed and that kind of thing. You start seeing a little bit more of the inspiration behind that. Also, the tail. The tail definitely was raccoon inspired. I want to add a little bit more of a raccoon element. So like for his Rugeru form, I took the stripes from Ruger's long sleeve shirt and I made them more zigzag, like like how some people depict raccoons as sometimes. I mean, raccoons have more straight stripes, but like, you have like zigzagoon. I took that and I decided to do that to make him look a little more like a raccoon, to give him more of a unique tail and make him feel a little bit more fantastical, basically just make him like this big hulking dog slash ape slash raccoon type of creature, just to give him more of that fantastical appearance instead of just look straight more like a cartoon dog, which he is. Make him just look a little bit more fantastical, because I find that some of the like those elements of like combining different animals more interesting. Not in the way where they're like slapped together, like, oh, this animal's like a lion and a sheep. No, but like where there's a lot more thought, like the different elements and taxidermy of it all comes together to create that. Oh, by the way, speaking of which, did you know that Dr. Seuss did his own taxidermy? It's crazy. He gathered a bunch of like fallen off antlers from deers and such, and he would just make his own fictitious taxidermy. It's so funny. And they look really good too. They look amazing. Look up Dr. Seuss's taxidermy stuff. That's some really fun stuff to look at. But yeah, okay, now we're done. We're done with Ruger's character inspirations there. All right, back on to the other characters. All right, so Ruger's parents, by the way, their names are Remy and Anmi. But Anmi is just a nickname for her. Her full first name and second name is Anne Marie. But that came from Remy and and Marie came from they came from Gambit and Rogue because I fucking love Gambit and Rogue. But yeah, that's where the names for them came from. Like Ruger, they share the same name, Tritt, and that came from Travis Tritt. But also, Remy, Ruger's dad, has this shirt. It's an LSU shirt, and that's because my pop went to LSU. He graduated from there. And so I wanted to include that, not just because Louisiana stuff, but that's because my pop actually went to LSU and graduated. So it's very much tied to our family. Like we always root for it. We don't root for anyone else. I mean, we'll root for the Bulldogs if we have to. I mean, like they're fine. They're fine and dandy. But oh my god, dude, Roll Tide, fuck Roll Tide, dude. Unfortunately, I don't care that much about football, but when it comes to like LSU, I look daggers at Roll Tide, and then you go to the NFL, and it's just like, oh, okay, because we're Saints, and then we look at the Falcons, and it's like, oh, the Dirty Birds, Dirty Birds. Yeah, them dead. Yeah. Anyway, I'm a traitor to my own state when it comes to sports. Anyway, that's where that came from. And fun fact, Remy's name also is shit could be like if you extend to Remington is another gun. It's a shotgun specifically. Although there's no plans to have Remy turn into a werewolf. I mean, Remy's dead. So but yeah. So the Landrys, I actually forgot what I gave their names at the moment. I completely forgot. I think it was Marcel and Gretchen. I just gave them like that last minute, and I just gave them kind of like a name that I thought last name that I thought would fit. But yeah, there's not much else to them. They're just put in as neighbors, and I just gave them like more normal designs essentially. But the werewolf that Ruger encounters, that werewolf's name is Lebel, and that is actually another French firearm thing. It's a French rifle. So again, continuing on with that theme. But so Lebel is meant to be this distorted werewolf. Like this is like the monster werewolf that you normally see in these horror stories. And the design of it, I'll get to the music in a second, but I'm about to go into a mini rant when I talk about this. But the design was based off of Saber Wolf from Killer Instinct and Von Helsing's werewolf form. Like the werewolves in Von Helsing were amazing. And it makes me so mad that in like more modern movies and TV shows, like live action stuff like that, they can't make good werewolves. It's like so rare to find any amazing werewolf designs because they usually go for this because they go for like this emaciated design and it looks so decrepit, or they just turn into a wolf. Not even like a man wolf, just turn into a wolf. They don't do anything interesting. I'm not saying that like they're just turning into like a wolf that's like anthropod, this is like an anthropic. Sorry, I'm not saying that like doing an anthro wolf is totally more interesting these designs, but it feels like they go too hard and try like, oh, it's a decrepit monster and stuff. But like, no, when Goosebumps, the Jack Black Goosebumps movie, has a better werewolf design than most of the other werewolves out there in live action stuff, there's a problem. There's a problem. It literally has fucking Looney Tunes ass sneakers. What was the what was that red monster from Looney Tunes? Red monster name. Gossamer. It literally has the fucking Gossamer shoes and like blue shorts, but it's such a peak design. It's such a good design, but like if you're not able to match that, brother, come on. I'm not saying you can't go for a more decrepit werewolf design, but I feel like there's a problem with werewolves and stuff where people are just like, oh man, we don't want to do just like a wolf man that's kind of generic. We need to be more creative, and it feels like they're ironically going to the same place, and they're just making them look decrepit and not cool or like, terrifying are just like, cool. I know that sounds stupid, but like as I was mentioning with Saberwolf, like in Killer Instinct, that is a terrifying werewolf design. Like it looks feral, it has that kind of like emaciated design, but it still looks like a wolf man essentially. He still looks like a werewolf. He looks sick. He looks terrifying. He looks manic. But he doesn't look like... The problem is that they lean way too much into making them look decrepit. I don't keep using the word, but it's intentional because they look like inbred, basically. They look like they've lost a lot of their fur and they're just kind of like skinny to the bone and stuff. They don't look like werewolves. They just look like hairy, homeless, balding men that are both hairy all over and yet are having male pattern baldness all across their body. And they happen to have fangs and stuff. It's just, I don't know, man. I don't know. I feel like we just gotta go, we gotta go back to basics. We gotta go simple. It works for a reason. It works for a reason. Oh man. Anyway, but anyway, back to LaBelle. So the music inspirations, back to Killer Instinct, Lycanthropy by Mick Gordon was this song that inspired LaBelle's design, and like also inspired the sequence of like when Ruger just encounters him for the first time. Just, oh my god, dude, Mick Gordon is just amazing with music. Like I know, like we always talk about like, oh man, his Doom stuff is incredible. Check out his Killer Instinct OST. It's amazing. Seasons 1, Seasons 2. Check those out. Amazing stuff. Holy crap. Oh my god, dude. Oh, dude, it's just so freaking good. But another song that inspired LaBelle's character is Black Dog by Led Zeppelin. That's another one. There's not how much there else. It's just, I kind of wasted my energy talking about the werewolf form. But really, Black Dog was just kind of like the vibe I was listening to for spoiler stuff that I won't get into here. That's just what I'll say. All right, now the Pere-Mafe. So that thing, basically, that giant swamp monster that Ruger encounters with the horns, that giant muck monster is the Pere-Mafe. The Pere-Mafe is a swamp monster in Louisiana that is composed of muck and Spanish ivy. And that's what you saw in him as well. You saw like bits like Spanish ivy, you saw the muck, you saw the branches and stuff that came from the trees that have the fucking ivy hanging over them and stuff. That's what inspired the characters. This was Pere-Mafe. But the music inspiration, really, there was only one song, and that was Swamp by Talking Heads. And that was used because it leads into more of the further plot of the series and the purpose of the Pere-Mafe and some of the other creatures in this series. So it was that kind of thing. As for the inspirations beyond the Pere-Mafe, I took inspiration from Pluto, specifically like how in the Pluto anime. So, by the way, I need to clarify. Pluto, I'm not talking about the Roman god. I am talking about Pluto, the robot character from Astro Boy. And in Astro Boy, there's this robot called Pluto that was basically going out there and murking all of these other robots, essentially. And specifically in the Pluto anime and the manga, it was basically using this devil horn it like a image as a calling card of sorts. Like in the beginning, you saw Mont Blanc's head and two branches basically sticking in between it, trying to make it look like devil horns and stuff. And so I decided to do that for the Pere-Mafe to give it more of a unique look, to make it look a little bit more like terrifying and kind of more like a boogeyman. It's simple, but I thought it worked. But yeah, those are the characters basically for this episode. Now then, let's get on to the trivia. So, the original plot of this episode was meant to be a story for Crips and Cowboys that I mentioned earlier. And basically, this is how Ruger was going to be introduced, where Ruger was fighting against a vampire who stole from an insurance company for cryptids and was basically going to use the data that he found and sell it to people, essentially. God, that's not like that happens nowadays. Oh, boy. But later, the vampire turned into another character, another Louisiana cryptid, the Grunch Road Monster. And I'll talk about him soon once he's introduced. But he's planning to appear soon, and it's tied to Ruger as kind of like a rival character. But again, the plot was heavily changed and replaced with the origin story here. And as I mentioned, and because of that, Ruger, the Wolf of New Orleans was originally going to start with Ruger already being a werewolf, a Rougarou. But I decided to do his origin story and use it as a chance to delve more into the horror side of things to help make this series more unique. By the way, as well, with Labelle, I was going to have them refer to him as a loup-garou, the original French word for rougarou. But then I started realizing, okay, this might get a little bit too confusing if I'm just pulling out loup-garou and rougarou, and if people say it too fast, it's going to sound the same. So I'm going to reserve that for later and try to find a better way to use that term, because there was a pointed reason why I wanted to use that. It's because the monsters of the main villainess, once she gets revealed, they're all French inspired for the most part. And I wanted that to be more of a stickler point, because to help make the difference of like the French origin versus the more blended Cajun origin of Ruger's werewolf design. I wanted to make it more of a point of that. Anyway, so yeah, that's about there. The second half, though, this is where I was talking about, like, with limitations and stuff. The second half was supposed to introduce the main villainess of the story, and she was supposed to start off seeming like an ally. She was going to, like, make Ruger feel like he was safe. She was going to, like, lead him to her lair and make him think that she was an ally, and they revealed that, like, she was the one behind all this on accident, but then she just goes full into it, like, oh, I wasn't meaning to do this earlier, but we're going to do this now. Like, just reveal her character and just do that. And it was supposed to introduce Ben as well. Ben being captured and then breaking free to fight her. But as you could probably tell, that's a lot to put in that second half. And I changed it to be where we just see Ruger a little bit more alone and then facing the Pere Maffei. But also, I got feedback more so on the Ben part. Some people were worried that it made Ben seem like he was just kind of being neutered in a weird way. In terms of, like, he felt like he would... Not neutered. But when I got feedback on Ben, and people were saying they were worried that it just felt like Ben was being downplayed or being disrespected with how he was already captured. And I was like, well, in my mind, Ben's been captured before, like with the Flatwood Monster later on in Unbreakable Iron Ranger. But I do see where they're coming from. Like, if I'm going to bring in Ben, and he's already had his character arc, it's best to show him more like his own like to show him in a more how do I say this? It's best to not make it seem like I'm disrespecting him, even though that wasn't my intent. Like, my whole intent was that Ben was already on a mission to find this thing, got captured, but then managed to break free on his own, and then, like, reveal himself there, essentially. But I do understand where people were coming from with that. But as a whole, with the villainess being revealed, I also just realized, like, this is way too much for this first episode. Already, Ruger's family is dead. He's being exiled from his own home because his neighbors think that he's this murderous wolf dog when he isn't. And trying to introduce this and that plot twist all in one episode in under 30 pages would have been too much. And so I decided to take that out and replace it with Pere Maffei. Like I said, I was wanting to do more, but it got a little bit too much. That's why I put those limitations in place to help, funnel and create better ideas. And like, use my ideas better, and save other ideas for later or discard them. But yeah, that's about it for the episode itself. Why don't we get into the question section? Vintage Crusader, question: does the world of Unbreakable Iron Ranger have a power system? And if so, how does it work? So no, it does not have a set power system. Things are kind of more of a Rochambeau approach, where, like, because the Breakable Iron Ranger, I was wanting to do different things, and so I didn't have a set power system, especially because I was worried that I wouldn't do it right. There's a lot of people that know how to do a power system justice, like a very strict power system justice, but I didn't know if I could do that. So I decided to go more of a Rochambeau approach, or more appropriately, similar to how in JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, stands have this kind of, like, they have their abilities and stuff, and it all depends on, like, the user and their abilities. And I want it to be more of, like, with Ben going up against these different opponents, using his skills and abilities to counter their powers and stuff. I was thinking more of, like, how Ben was this regenerative character, and he was going up against characters that were very destructive in one way or another. So that's how I was thinking about it. I wasn't thinking of, like, a power system. I was just thinking more, like I said, of Rochambeau. How does Ben counter this? How does Ben go about and find their weakness, essentially, in that regard? Not like everybody had hockey, not like everybody had stands or chakra or anything like that. I just wanted it to be more like, okay, Ben has to find a way to counteract this ability or to get stronger and that kind of thing. I know that sounds like it might be more complicated, but for me, it makes more sense in my head. It's more fun, It goes back to like that kind of limitation because, like, I don't know, that's weird. Having a power system in my mind feels like too limiting. It's fine having limits and guidelines, but I feel like if I had a power system like that and the world kept on expanding, I feel like I might ended up not using it right, and I might ended up adding on bullshit just to make things more engaging story wise, because that's sometimes a pitfall, is that when you make a power system like that, it's easy for some things to count, like the power system to get contradicted against, and like there's new stuff that's added on or retconned on there. And so I didn't want to do that. Like I said, I was already having a problem deciding whether or not I want the story to go on for long or not. So I was like, I'm not adding a complicated power system. I'm just going to keep things really simple. Mr. Sundown, what tips would you have for world building? The biggest tip I would have is basically understand your story's themes and the characters, and then you could start building the world. There's a big problem sometimes where like people get really into the lost in the sauce of world building, and they have a completely different idea about like what's necessary world building and what's just like fluff. Like again, there's a lot of people that would get like try to do this whole J.R.R. Tolkien like tier world building and stuff. But the problem is that you're not everybody's like Tolkien. And that's fine. That's totally fine. But the world building has to fulfill a purpose for the story, essentially. Like in One Piece, exactly. Okay, so there's pirates all over the world. So there's pirates all over the world. Is there a rule of body or the governments? Yes, there are. There's like the different governments with the kingdoms. There's the world government, and then there's the marine force that's enforced in order to help counteract the pirates in the system. You have to think about, okay, so this thing exists. Is there anything that exists in relation to it to either counter it or to justify its existence? That's basically how the world building needs to be approached. Not just to excuse so much stuff, but like it helps build things. If you're able to, you can end up being like Oda, and everything basically connects, and it's crazy how much stuff connects in One Piece. But it all comes from a place of purpose, essentially. It all comes from a place of purpose. You don't want things to just be, oh, I just want to have all this stuff together, or just like making things too simple or getting way too lost in the sauce. It has to make sense for the story and what you're trying to achieve with the story in order for things to move forward or to cause obstacles and things like that. Like, I'll talk about this in episode 2, but I completely forgot about like a plot point that I made in episode 2 that I realized, oh, this makes sense to exist and gives a bit more of a reason for this to continue on going on longer and stuff. We'll talk about that when I get to episode 2 of Unbreakable Iron Ranger. But essentially, world building has to have purpose beyond just being the lore. Because again, sometimes you get too lost in the sauce, you get too caught up in like this whole like prose and world building and fluff that, while it's cool, can end up drowning out the story. Again, it goes back to what I was saying earlier about you want to make sure you have guidelines and limitations in what you're trying to focus on. So it helps you hone in on what the story needs to be and what themes you're telling, what your characters are. Because if you get so expand upon, you lose what the original story and point is going to be. And there's a ton of stories that end up going down that path that things feel off and they don't feel like they have that focus anymore because they start expanding on way too much into this other stuff that the original point and intent of the story is lost because it literally got lost in the ever expanding woods. So yeah, hopefully that makes sense. Before going with LaRuger and location for The Wolf of New Orleans, was there any other characters you were considering on giving them their own focused storyline? So, before The Wolf of New Orleans, there really wasn't, but there was like a bunch of different plot points that I have for Crips and Cowboys that I do want to see if I can make like a special series for. Like, there was this plot I made for Tennessee, and specifically involving the hollers and stuff. But this plot in Tennessee where there's like this Toku theme, because in a lot of Toku shows and Power Rangers, especially early Power Rangers, they were fighting in these like valleys and these construction sites and these not caverns, but like these these areas with like a lot of mountains and like carved out mountainsides and things like that, and these mine areas and construction sites and stuff. Like these little deep like working depots and such. And so I decided to use that for like vocation, like this hidden holler, where this Toku inspired hero essentially protected the holler from all these different cryptids in Tennessee, and he was trying to find an heir and successor, essentially. That was the plot point I had, but I don't know if I'll be able to, when I'll be able to do it, but that's a plot that I really would like to do as its own story. I think that'd be really cool and really neat. There was also this other plot that was going to be more Cherry-centric, where the gang was having to help rescue her from this cult of magic users that were in, of all places, Detroit. I know, that sounds weird, but I was like, oh man, this would be fun. Like a bunch of like this, like a freaking cult of Mad Max type of witches and wizards and warlocks and such that basically had like a bunch of different machinery and different magic and stuff. I thought that would be cool, but like it didn't go. Or like with Crips and Cowboys going the way they did, I don't know if I'll be able to do that. I do have plans though for like a Hayes miniseries and a Toma miniseries if I'm able to get to them. But I would like to, honestly. It would probably take place for Toma, probably like somewhere in Alabama or maybe even Florida. I'm not sure yet, but that's stuff I want to do for sure. But yeah. L Rocksteady, is there a certain era of animation art that you vibe with as the most as part of your inspiration? 90s and 2000s animation. Doesn't matter if it's from the West or the East. I just vibe with that the most. Although I do vibe with a lot of like older cartoons, obviously Looney Tunes, obviously, but also Hanna-Barbera, like like Tom and Jerry, and also just like the Hanna-Barbera era of cartoons. Like I grew up watching Boomerang, so I watched a ton of shows from there back in the day. Fun fact, by the way, one of the Banana Split gang, there was a kid, the orange gorilla dude, the orange ape. I used as a character inspiration for this skunk ape character that I was going to create. And I was honestly at some point wanting to just make a character based off of each member of the Banana Splits gang, but I got stuck on the elephant, so whoops. I wasn't able to figure out a design that felt like inspired by the elephant, but didn't feel too goofy or feel too edgy. And I was like, oh man, I don't know, man. I got to figure this out. So, whoops. But yeah, there's that. But like I said, a lot of my biggest inspiration really was that era of 90s and 2000s anime and cartoons, because I grew up with that era. Like I was born in 1997. I grew up with that era of just watching that type of animation. So it hits harder for me. That was like my generation's animation for the most part. And so for me, it inspired a lot of my stuff. Like I've talked about before, but like Imaashi was one of my favorite artists. Mike Mignola's comic art is incredible, but also like older 90s anime. That seems weird just calling it older, but like, I have to say it because it is older. It was made in the 90s. It's about like almost 30 years ago, some of these shows. It feels like, but like Outlaw Star, Trigun, Slayers, Getter Robo Armageddon, the JoJo OVA, different anime like that. Was Gal Gaigar Gal Gaigar was 90s. I thought it was about to enter the 2000s, but yeah. Gal Gaigar, yes. But shows like that. Then also like 2000s anime like Soul Eater, Full Metal Alchemist, Bobobo. Shows like that really inspired by animation style, like my art style. And yeah. Also, yeah, another one, Fooly Cooly, Dead Leaves, Gurren Lagann, obviously. But those shows definitely had a big inspiration for me. But like I said, the reason why I'm able to do more cartoony stuff is because of like growing up watching Looney Tunes, Tom and Jerry, and endless Hanna-Barbera cartoons on Boomerang. So yeah, man, like just having like all those different little like music videos stuck in my just on loop, like the one with Josie and the Pussycats, the greatest fucking ska song ever made for the Jabberjaw music video. I swear that's the greatest ska song ever made. Also the El Kabong music video too, that was great. But yeah, honestly, it's kind of funny because like Ruger, you could basically get a bunch of characters for that together and they just make your own mystery gang. But yeah. But yeah, definitely shows like that. Of course, like Cartoon Network as well. A lot of shows, like Johnny Bravo, Powerpuff Girls, Courage the Cowardly Dog, but then Samurai Jack. Samurai Jack especially, bro. Oh my god. But yeah, that era of animation definitely was a big influence for me there. But yeah, that's about it for this episode. Next week, we're going to be talking about episode 2 of Unbreakable Iron Ranger. And the episode after that is going to be the raffle topic. And then we're going to get back on schedule with talking about different episodes and concepts and stuff. But yeah, thank you guys so much for listening to this episode. I hope you guys have a wonderful rest of your day, and God bless.